Hey y'all, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make oceans in Blender. And I know what you're thinking, I've seen 100 of those kind of tutorials. And yeah, you have probably, but the difference with this one is that we're going to make large scale oceans in Blender. So what you may have noticed in other tutorials is they'll get the ocean modifier, they'll make a nice little patch of ocean, bring the camera right down low and do a nice little render like that. But what if you wanted to do something like this? So to do this, we're still going to be using the ocean modifier, but rather than rendering it directly, we're going to use it to export displacement maps instead. And we're going to put those into our own shader, assign it to like a big ass plane, and then use displacement to generate our ocean instead. So that means you can kind of render it from pretty much any angle. You want to do tight shots, you want to do wide shots, fly over it, whatever you want to do. So let's get into it. Okay, before we get started, let's open up their preferences. And you want to make sure that you have the Node Wrangler add-on, but just make sure it's activated here just by typing node in the search and turning on the checkbox. And then you're all good to go. So let's get rid of the default cube and the default light. And then we're just going to add a plane and push F9 to bring up the plane settings here. And we're going to make it 200 meters. And then let's just zoom out, have a look at that. Okay, that's looking good. We want to get a bit more resolution in here, so just tab into edit mode, right click, go subdivide, push F9 again, and then set your number of cuts here to 64. And then tab out of edit mode again, and that's good to go. Okay, so this is going to be our ocean preview plane. So we're never actually going to render this, but we're going to set up the settings in the ocean modifier on this plane, and then we'll be exporting displacement maps out of the ocean modifier and actually rendering those on a different object. So let's rename our plane here, and we're going to call it Ocean Preview A, because we're going to make a couple of these, but we're just going to start off with the one. And then we go into the modifiers panel here, go add modifier ocean, and you want to turn it from this generate mode into displace mode so that it's actually displacing the geometry that we've created rather than making its own. So I've kind of gone and worked out some good settings for this already. Of course, feel free to play with these settings and do whatever you want. So when you're adjusting your settings on this, keep in mind that this is actually a 200 meter patch of ocean. So you don't really want to have like one sort of big wave in the middle. You probably want to go for like a bunch of sort of smaller waves across the surface. And this will kind of help us later on when we're tiling this on our render. So let's put in these settings here. So we're going to start off by turning up the resolution. We're going to go pretty high with this, and yeah, I'm sorry, unfortunately it'll make things a little bit slow, but the resolution here, you need to kind of set it first because it can drastically change the look of all the other settings if you adjust it later. So we're going to leave choppiness on 1. We're going to set the scale to 2. This smallest wave here, we're going to set that down to 0 just to make sure that it's not filtering out any details at all, because we want maximum detail. Our wind velocity here, we're going to set to 10. One important one that I forgot here is our spatial size. Because we've set our plane to 200 meters, we're going to put 200 in here, because any less of a value will tile the texture in the motion modifier, which we don't want because we're going to be doing that ourselves later in the shader. You may notice here it's looking a bit kind of blocky. We can just right click and go shade smooth. And it's not really showing a lot of detail here at the moment, but we can fix that by adding a subdivision surface. Push the up arrow to put it in before the ocean modifier. So render setting, you can just ignore that. We're not going to do anything with that. So this is purely for viewport. And I would say adjust this based on, you know, the speed of your computer. I'll put this up to probably 3. And that'll give us a nice sort of view of the detail we're getting in here. You can turn it up a little bit more as well if your computer's pretty quick. And so that gives us a pretty good idea of what our ocean is going to look like. Another couple of settings here, I'm going to add some alignment just to make the waves kind of go a bit more in one direction. We're going to set that direction to like 200 just to put it off axis. And turn this dampening down to 0. And so one last thing we're going to do is we need to animate this time value. So I'm going to set our frame here to 0, set the time to 0, and then we're just going to hover over time, push the I key, set a keyframe. I'm not going to do a full 250 frames here, we'll just go to 150. And we'll set this time to 6. Now I believe this time value is in seconds. So that's how I usually set it up initially, just keyframe it like as if it is in seconds. But there's nothing stopping you from adjusting the timing if you want to speed things up or slow things down later on, but we'll start off with just setting it as seconds. One last thing to do here is just in your timeline, hover your mouse over here, push the T key, set it to linear. And at this point, it might be a good opportunity just to do a quick save. So this is looking pretty good, but it's still a bit hard to kind of tell if this is really looking like an ocean. So let's take it a step further. We're going to drag up here and create a shader editor. We'll grab this material that's still in the scene, rename it to Ocean Preview, and let's make it a bit more oceany. We'll put in roughness down to 0. We're going to set our base color also down to black. Our IOR, index of refraction, will make it 1.333, which is the index of refraction for water. And now if we go into our look dev mode here, this can make it a bit easier to see if our ocean is looking kind of like an ocean. We can try one of these other HDRs here. This one here with a kind of green sort of grass field doesn't work too bad. So I've supplied an HDR in the comments that we're going to use for the rendering, so that might be good just to set that one up now, and so we can see it in our preview as well. So let's go into our world settings here in our shader editor, and then we're just going to Shift A. And one thing I like to do is this search here, you can actually assign a shortcut key to it. So if you right click, assign shortcut, and we're just going to push Control Shift A. And so now this search has its own shortcut. So now when we use it, we can just type stuff and find it pretty quickly. So we actually want an environment texture. Drop that down, click open and load up the HDR from the comments. And we're going to hook that into our background color there. What you can also do with the environment texture node selected, just Control T, and that'll just set up the nodes here so that you can do things like rotate the HDR. So in the viewport, then we want to just go to this drop down and use the scene world, and it'll take a second to load. And there we go. It doesn't look too different, but we can rotate the HDR here, and it's got like a nice kind of sun and everything in there, so that looks pretty nice. And we can see that our ocean is really kind of coming together here. I'm going to quickly show you what I've done to this HDR image, because I've made some modifications from the original, which I got from HDRI Haven. So we'll just switch this to an image editor here and load up the image. So a couple of things you'll notice. What I first did was took the whole sky and then just flipped it. And so this adds like basically a little bit of sky below the horizon, because sometimes when you're making these ocean effects for optimization purposes, you might not want to have to render all the way right out to the horizon. So having just a little bit of sky underneath the horizon in the HDR helps us to cheat things a little bit. Then what I've also done is just added some kind of oceany sort of colors you can see here underneath it. In this example today, we're not going to use any transparency in our ocean shader, just as kind of a bit of a cheat to keep render times down. But if you do want to, this will make sure that you're not seeing like, you know, the sky or the ground or something through your ocean. So these are good kind of little tweaks that you can make to any HDR image that you might want to use for like an open ocean sort of render. So back to the shader editor. And we're just going to turn the strength down a little bit here on our background as well. We'll make it 0.7. And at this point, let's grab our camera. We'll switch into the view camera mode. Select our ocean by clicking on it. We're going to want to push N, go into our view mode, lock camera to view, and then in the viewport, push the backtick key, view selected. So one issue we're going to run into here with a large sort of scene scale is that the default clipping planes for the cameras and the viewport and so on are set a little bit low. So let's go into our camera settings here. You'll see this clip start and end. We want to set the end up to, we'll put it up to 4,000. And there we go. We've got some ocean. You'll probably want to do the same in the viewport settings here as well. This end setting here at the moment, we'll just turn that up to 4,000 as well. You may need to again tweak it a bit later, but that'll do us for the time being. So that's looking cool. I mean, at this stage as well, you could just go into the view menu here and render a viewport render animation to check the motion on your ocean. But I know the settings are good for what we're doing, so this is fine. So that's all good, all set up. Let's go back to our modifier panel here. We're just going to do 150 frames here. So actually, let's just set our scene to be 150. Push home here to reset that. In our bake ocean settings, let's make that 150. One thing I will say though is if your machine is slow, if baking out at this resolution is fairly slow, you could probably just bake out a frame or two just for test rendering purposes. And then when you're ready to do the whole animation, bake the whole frame range out. So we're just going to set our cache path here, and these textures we're going to be reading back into render. So put them somewhere where you can get at them again later. And another thing to note is we're going to be doing a couple of different versions of this ocean cache. So we'll put it into a folder called Ocean A, because then we'll make it like an Ocean B as well that we'll use. So let's go accept on that. And then we simply just have to click Bake Ocean and wait. Okay, so now that the bake is done, there's a little weird kind of bug in the ocean modifier. Once you've done a bake, like the bake is a little bit kind of offset from what gets generated in real time. So once the bake is done, just to make sure that we're going to be getting the proper result, just change your frame number. So it doesn't matter too much what it is. So we're just going to set this down to 1. Now we're just going to do a little bit of housekeeping here with our scene. Because our previews aren't ever going to be rendered, we might just stick them in their own collection here. So let's push M, select new collection. We'll call this Ocean Preview. So we have an Ocean Preview collection with Ocean Preview in it. Well, let's add our render filters to our outline here. So we just want the little TV one and the little camera one in this filter drop down. And one other thing we're going to need is we're just going to make a little empty plane axes here. And we're going to just rename it to texture placement. And I'll show you what this is for a little bit later, but we may as well just make it now. So to create the actual surface that we need for our ocean, I found the best object to use is not a plane like this, but is actually kind of a disc. And that way, with a disc, you're always going to get an even line at your horizon. You'll never get kind of a bump where you might be looking down the horizon and see the corner of a plane. So this just means that wherever your camera is turning, you're just going to get a nice flat horizon line. So to do that, let's go, well, first of all, let's just turn off lock camera to view here. Let's go Shift A, add, and we want a circle. Press F9 to bring up the settings. For vertices, we only want 8 because we're going to subdivide. The radius, let's make it 200 because that's the magic number. We also want to set the fill type to triangle fan. Now that's done. We'll make this a little bit smaller here. Tab into edit mode, push 2 to go into edge mode, alt click the outside edge, then we're going to push E for extrude, press escape, S to scale, and then just type 20. And that'll give us a nice, should be 4,000 by 4,000, 8,000 by 8,000, that'll do. And here we go with our clipping plane issue here. So again, go in here, go to the view, set this to like 20,000, that'll do. And one last thing we want to do to the disk now that we can see the whole thing is tab back into edit mode, press Ctrl R, and just add a couple of segments, push escape to drop them down, and just something like that will do just to help with the subdivision. We're just going to take the opportunity now as well to set up some render settings. We're going to want cycles for this. If you've got some decent GPUs, switch it over to GPU compute. I found it uses about 4 gigs of GPU RAM with my tests, so you might need like kind of a 6 gig card or something at least to render this, but we'll see how we go. There's other settings as well which I'll go through which can help with memory usage and render speed and stuff. So feature set, we want to set this to experimental. We're going to go down here into subdivision. This dicing rate, we can turn this up a little bit. 2 is a good sort of starting point. And again, this is just to try and save GPU RAM while we're rendering. Preview, let's turn that down a bit so we get a bit more detail in our preview. Now, important one, this off-screen scale, you want to crank this. Let's go 10. This will just mean that anything outside of the camera's view won't get subdivided down. So it'll just, again, help with memory usage with your render. Max subdivisions, we can leave it at 12 for the moment. If you're finding you're not getting enough detail, you can turn this up, but be very careful because again, this will chew up your graphics card memory. And let's just rename our circle to ocean. And let's go in the modifiers panel. We're going to add 2 subdivision surfaces. So hit 1, hit the second one. This first subdivision modifier is just to give the renderer a little bit of a helping hand, give it kind of a base level of subdivision to start from. And then the second subdivision will turn on to adaptive, and this will refine the mesh down to the exact level of detail we need to get all the detail that we want in our render. So set the first subdivision, set the render. You could probably set it to 3 or 4. Again, depends on your machine. You might need to tweak this if you're running out of GPU RAM. Viewport, we could probably just turn up to 2. And let's work now on the shader for this ocean. So drag this guy up a bit. We want to go back into object mode. We'll pick our ocean preview shader and then just duplicate it. Name it just to ocean. Now we want to go Control-Shift-A in here, add our image texture, Control-Shift-A again, add a vector displacement node. In our image texture, we want to go and pick our ocean displacement map that came out of the ocean modifier. So you'll see if you go into that folder that we specified, you'll have this image sequence here. Pick the first frame here, hold down Control and Shift, and then pick the last frame so you select all of them. Or you can just push the A key as well if you've only got one image sequence in your folder here. Detect sequences is on. Let's go open image, and then we need to change this to image sequence. And you'll see it's detected 150 frames, that's great. Turn on the auto refresh option, and then let's hook in our color into our vector here. In our vector displacement itself, we want to set this tangent space, change it to world space. Select our image texture here as well and hit Control T to set up our mapping parameters. In this one, we're going to use the object mode. So we're going to plug object into vector. We're going to change the mapping type to texture. We're going to pick our texture placement object here, our empty. And in our scale parameters here, we're going to put in our ocean size. So remember it was 200. Let's just put 200 in all of these. That's our scale from our ocean modifier originally. In the location, you have to set the X and Y location to be minus half of the scale. So scale is 200, we're going to go minus 100, minus 100. And so what this does is we're essentially telling it to just use a world coordinate scale, because this texture placement, we're just going to leave it at the origin, not going to touch it. Now one other little thing I discovered is this displacement map that comes out of the ocean modifier isn't actually in a Blender world space. So what you have to do, Control-Shift-A, and we want a separate RGB, and Control-Shift-A, and a combine RGB. And we're going to use these two nodes to swap the Y and Z axis in our displacement map. And so let's go color into this image here. The X is the same, so red into red, red is X. G is Y, so G is going to go into B, and B is Z, so Z into Y. So we're basically swapping the Y and Z axis, and then image goes into our vector displacement. And then the displacement output from this goes into our displacement on our material output. And now you should see in your viewport, if you're on look dev mode, it's done a little bit of a normal map here. So just as a preview for us, which is very, very handy. We're just going to take a moment to save at this point, Control S, because we're about to do a little bit of a render. But one last thing that you need to do is, and this is always a gotcha, I've so many times just forgotten to do this and wondered why my displacements weren't working. With our ocean selected, we need to go into the shader settings tab here, the little red ball, scroll down to the bottom, under settings in here, and we need to make sure that our displacement is set to something other than bump only. The best detail result you're going to get is with displacement only. But again, if you're having trouble with rendering this with graphics card memory or computer memory or whatever, displacement and bump does a pretty good job as well. But I'm going to set this to displacement only. And so we're going to do a comparison render here, just to make sure that what we're getting out of our ocean preview plane matches exactly what we're getting in our ocean displacement render. So that means that you'll know whatever settings that you're setting up on your ocean preview planes will translate perfectly into the final render. So let's do our ocean preview plane first. So with our ocean, we'll just turn off the render flag here. And in fact, let's turn the whole thing off. And we have our ocean preview here. And let's hit F12 for a render. Cool, okay. Now push J in here, and that will take us to a second slot for our render. You can close this window out at that point. And now we're going to set our ocean preview collection here to not render. So turn off the render flag for that. And then let's just show our full size ocean again and push F12 to do another render. And now fingers crossed, I hope this works. Yes, look at that. I mean, you'll notice this is just pushing J to switch between the two. You will notice there's a little bit less detail in the preview plane. You can turn up that subdivision surface setting in here, that initial subdivision surface. Yeah, we only had it set for 2. So you can turn that up as well, and that should give you a bit more detail in the view. But that's actually looking really good. I'm very happy with that. So you'll remember I was talking about this is going to be a tiled texture. Now let's see what it looks like off into the horizon. Because we're simply tiling one texture here at the moment, we are going to see kind of a lot of tiling artifacts. So let's switch into our camera view here. We'll lock our camera to the view, rotate this around so we're kind of looking off into the horizon here. And let's give that another quick render. So as you can see here, it's looking pretty kind of crappy. This tiling issue it's the same in any of these kind of systems. They all use these same kind of algorithms to generate ocean, whether it's Houdini, Maya, they all use these same settings. And so all of them suffer from this issue. And so I'm going to show you various techniques that you can use to kind of help get around this problem. I mean, it's the one kind of downside about doing it this way is that you're always going to kind of battle a little bit with this tiling issue to try and get rid of it. But yeah, I'll show you some techniques here, and it's not too hard. It's not too difficult to get rid of it. So let's just kill this. We'll select our ocean here. So technique number 1 is, you'll notice if you look at an actual ocean photo, like of a wide scale ocean photo, there's actually kind of little patches of kind of flatter looking ocean. You'll get this kind of really wavy, bumpy stuff. And then you'll also get these kind of sections where it's a little bit flatter, if we add those kind of effects into it, that's one way to help not only add some realism, but also help with this tiling issue. So the way I like to do that is we're just going to control space, make this a bit bigger. Control Shift A in here, and we're going to add a noise, and we want a color ramp. We're going to Control T on our noise texture here to create our mapping nodes, but we're going to get rid of this texture coordinate here, and we're just going to use this one here, connecting the object into the vector. From our noise texture, connect the factor into the factor on our color ramp. Because we want to create very sort of defined patches of this noise, we're going to just drag these two sliders closer together here. It doesn't matter where exactly for the moment, because we will preview what they look like. And then we're just going to grab our color and hook this into the scale of our vector displacement. And just to make a bit of room here, I might just twirl this principled BSDF out of the way. So Control Space to get out of this. So what we can do here, if we want to preview what this looks like with our node wrangler, it will enable us to do so very easily by Control Shift clicking on this color ramp here. So let's just go here, turn off the lock camera. Now don't forget in this mapping node to set it to texture, which I forgot. So now turn this scale up to 400, 400, 400. And let's look through the camera view again. I might just hide this ocean preview. Okay. So you can see we're getting these kind of big patches here. Adjust the scale again. We probably want to do something like maybe that sort of size. Turn the detail up a little bit just to give us a bit more of a breakup around the edges here. And the color ramp as well, you use this to kind of set how big these patches are going to be. So bringing the black up will make them larger. You probably don't want that much. So maybe something like that will work. Also, you don't want this black to be black. So select that little swatch here. Go for a value of about 0.8, I found works fairly well. Now let's push F11 again to bring up our render view. Push J to switch into our other slot here. Oh, and sorry, we forgot to switch our shader back. So find your principled BSDF, Control Shift, click that again. I will actually try a comparison render here again. Okay. So if we switch between slot 1 and slot 2, you can see these sort of flattened areas showing up, and it is helping to break up the tiling. But I'm going to show you another way to do it as well, like another extra layer of breakup to help with this. So that involves making another ocean setup and blending the two ocean setups together. So let's show this again. We're going to hide our ocean. And we're going to just select our ocean preview plane here. Shift D to duplicate, push Escape to leave it at the origin. Let's pull this down a little bit. And so settings that I would recommend changing in here to make another ocean plane is definitely random seed, because random seed doesn't actually change the kind of settings that determine the shape of the ocean. It just kind of gives you a different version of those same settings. So just pick your seed here, just type any random number. And I'm just going to hide this first ocean preview here. And let's rename this while we're at it. Call it Ocean Preview B. The other thing that's good to try and break up this tiling is to make the spatial size a different value. So let's put in 300 in here for our spatial size. You can turn up the resolution as well to compensate, but you know, 40 is already pretty slow, and I found it looks pretty good anyway, regardless. And so because we've turned up this spatial size to get the proper preview of what it's going to look like in the viewport, you also want to scale up your plane. So we've gone up by a ratio of 1.5 in our scale. So let's just go scale 1.5, press enter. And if you check it in the N menu here, it should have in the item tab 300 by 300. And just to be safe, Control A and apply that scale. So that all looks good to me. Let's bake out this one. So in your cache path here, you may have called the first one Ocean A. Let's just change that to Ocean B. Push enter on that and hit Bake Ocean. Once that's done, we're done with our ocean previews. So let's just hit the checkbox and get rid of them entirely. Turn on our ocean render plane again, and back in the shader here, let's just control space and make this big again. We can copy and paste all of this stuff here. So you want the mapping, the displacement, texture, and the separate and combine RGBs. And in fact, we'll just move these guys up here a little bit. And so with these 4 nodes selected, let's just Shift D, drop them here. In this texture, let's hit the folder icon and pick Ocean B that was generated. Remember, Control Shift, select all those, detect sequences, yep. That's all good. Let's hook in our object into our mapping here. And remember, we'll need to adjust these scale and location settings to compensate for the larger ocean size that we went with. So that was 300, 300, 300, and this will be -150, -150. And so then to combine them, you simply just want a mix RGB, plug one image into the first color, one image into the second, and our color output will go into the vector. Just like our noise setting here, we're going to use a similar setup. So duplicate these as well, hook in our vector object, and then into the factor of the mix, we want to go from color in our color amp to the factor of the mix here. And in this case, we do want this darker swatch to be pure black, because we want to just mix from a solid version of one texture to a solid version of another texture. And just like before, let's go into our camera view. Let's Control Shift on this color ramp. And we're going to just tweak these settings because we don't want the same patches of noise affecting the 2 different kinds of ocean. So this is where our mapping node can come in handy. If we like, you know, all the scale and everything that we have for this, we can just use our Z location in the mapping node to give us kind of a different version of that same noise. But in this case, I'm going to just do another couple of little tweaks here. So I'm just going to go with something like that. That's all looking really good. Don't forget to Control Shift click back on your principled shader here. Let's do a Control S for save. F11 to bring up your render window here, and we're going to push the number 3 to go into our 3rd slot. So we've got our original, we've got our flat patches. Now number 3 is going to have the 2 different kinds of ocean. And I was so worried it was going to look bad. Okay, so there you go. That's pretty much cleared up all of the tiling issues that we had. So that's looking really cool. Let's get an animated camera in there and render up something cool. So let's close this down, do a quick save again, because you never know. I want to do one of those cool classic shots where you're like flying over the ocean, the camera's pointing down like it's in a helicopter, and then it kind of pans up and you're flying along the surface of the ocean. So what I'm going to do here is just split this window. This can be our camera view here. Let's get rid of these toolbars. Also, because of the scene scale, it can be a bit hard to find your camera. So just go into your camera settings here, viewport display, turn the size up to like 50, and there it is there. And I'm just going to Alt G, Alt R, and we'll sort of reset all the transforms. G, Z, and let's just pull the camera up over the surface a little bit. And we're just going to animate along the Y here. So we're just going to go GY, put it back here, set our frame to frame 1, and let's rotate X a little bit just so it's not dead straight, like pointing straight down. So give it a little bit of an angle there. Okay, and hit I, location, rotation. And then we're just going to go to frame 150. We'll do rotate X. Bring our camera up to something like this. And GY, make it fly along the surface. Something like that'll look pretty cool. Push I, location, rotation. Let's make this into a graph editor. Pick our Y location here. Turn off all the eyeballs on all the others. You can push home. You want to select both of these keyframes, push T, set to linear. Then turn off the eyeball for Y. Turn on the X rotation. Push home again. For this one, I want it to kind of be like just pan up over the first kind of 60 frames or so. So let's go GX and move this across. And I'm going to grab this bottom handle here and make it something like that. So it starts off, it doesn't ease into the move, it's kind of already moving up into its rotated position here. Our Z location here, I might bring the whole thing down a bit. So G, Y, just for a bit of extra drama. And speaking of drama, let's go into our camera and we want to make it a wide angle lens. At the moment it's set to a 50. Let's make it like a 24. It's going to look a lot cooler. So that's looking pretty good. I'll switch this back to a shader editor, go into the world mode, and let's just use this Z rotation here to kind of rotate our sun around. You can see it in the viewport here. Rotate it around to something like that. That looks pretty cool. Give that a save. And again, of course, you can just go into your view here and do a viewport render animation and make sure that it all looks good. So let's check that. And once it's finished rendering that viewport animation, you just go into render, view animation, and it'll open up a little flipbook thing for you. And yeah, that's looking pretty cool. One little small tweak I'm going to make is in the graph editor again. On our X rotation, I'm going to make the movement a little bit more natural, as if the cameraman kind of like he's panned up and he's overshot and he's come back down kind of thing. Just give it a bit more, a little bit more subtlety and of movement. So I moved here to about 105. So pick the channel here so that the curve comes up as a solid color. Push I, go only selected channels, and it'll just give you another keyframe here. So then you can just go GY, bring that bit down a bit. And so then it kind of comes up and then pans down a little bit. That looks good. So pick one of these frames, like a frame 130. Let's add a bit of motion blur to our render. We might need to turn our samples up a little bit here, but let's just roll with 128 for the moment. We can turn it up for the final quality render. Hit save again, and I'm going to go and do a little bit of compositing on this because we're not actually doing any transparency in our shader. It doesn't quite have like a real deep ocean feel yet, and I'll show you what I mean. Let's just I like to set this compositor up a little bit different. Usually kind of I reckon get rid of this dope sheet, turn off backdrop, and then kind of similar to what I had in the other 3D view, I'm going to split these two here, make them both image editors. We're going to go into the render menu here and turn off, like you don't want this new window popping up every time you render. So let's go keep user interface. We'll set this right hand one to our render result, and we're going to set the left hand one to viewer node. Turn on use nodes in the compositor here. And let's just do a quick render. So that's what we're getting at the moment. So just to give it a bit of depth, Control Shift A in here. Let's add in a RGB curves. Drop that in here. And all we're going to do is just in the shadows kind of part of the curve, just drag in a little point like this. And just gives you a little bit more contrast, as you can see here, a little bit of a deeper kind of color where the ocean is kind of darker. And it just gives it a bit more, yeah, like open ocean style feel. One more thing is we've got some pretty kind of bright highlights happening here on the ocean. So let's just add a little bit of glow. So we're going to add a glare node, drop that in. I can drop it in before the RGB curves. The defaults make this kind of crazy magic fairy dust look. So I'm just going to go change streaks to fog glow. Turn up to high quality. Less is more here, I think. So we'll turn the threshold up to sort of maybe 20. And let's mix it. Let's put the mix down to like minus 0.9. Turn the size down to 6, like which is the lowest it'll go. You just want to get a tiny little bit of glow. Maybe turn this up a little bit. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. So that's it, guys. Thanks again for watching. Check out the channel. I'm slowly building up the videos over time, and I'm going to be putting out more in the future. So definitely keep an eye on it. Hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you in the next one.